Okay. So welcome everyone to IPG Workshop 3. This is going to be in backward design number 2, looking at intercultural assessment tools. So as usual, a little bit of housekeeping at the beginning. So our expectations, thank you all for those of you who are able to arrive a little earlier. Hopefully we can try to start within the first few minutes of the hour. If you would like, you can rename your video. And it looks like mine always, even though I always click to have it set this way for all future meetings, it still reverts back to, whoops, it advanced my slides instead of allowing me to type in my name. So I'm going to do that real quick. Change my name, and I invite you all, if you would like to do that, you can change your name in your screen as well. We're going to have our videos on unless we're doing the fishbowl, which will be after our breakout session. But again, I want to acknowledge sometimes we do need to turn them off for very specific reasons. I understand that. And I am recording this session as well. We're going to last about 90 minutes for this session as usual. And unless you're taking a turn speaking, one of the expectations is that you'll have your microphone off just to minimize any background noise or feedback loops or anything like that. And I will try to do the same. And as always, our invitations and permissions, hear and be heard. This is a brave space. You're welcome and invited to speak to one another, not just to me. You don't have to go through me if you want to speak directly to one of your peers. And as always, we do have the chat available. You can either broadcast a chat message to everyone in the group, or there is an option in Zoom where you can select a specific person if you would like to send them a private message via chat. That is possible as well. So that is also an option, and I'll do my best to keep an eye on the chat as well. Don't freeze yourself or others in time. A lot of this conversation can be difficult, and remember that the impressions we gain about other people should be a collection of experiences rather than one isolated experience where maybe something went wrong. We have to let go of that experience when it happens and kind of move on, and do the same for ourselves. Don't freeze yourself and get stuck there as well. And that goes along with the next one, saying it ugly, or speaking in draft, as we've also established, which I really like. In fact, I might change this slide to just say speaking in draft. And of course, permission to mess up technology, which at least I'm being consistent, I think, with messing up technology. That's the one thing I can say about that. At least something goes wrong in every single workshop. And as always, I invite you all to share your own thoughts or ideas about something you'd like to see added to this list at any point now or in the future, via email or in the chat. I'm happy to add in anything that might help these conversations go more smoothly and be more productive. Our learning outcomes. So we're going to be working on our own empathy and self-awareness through the intercultural activity. And of course, getting that experience with leading an empathy and self-awareness activity. I'm going to invite one of you all to try out the Tiagi debriefing method when we get to that point, rather than me being the only one doing that. I do want to get you all some practice with that. So I might ask maybe even 2 or 3 of you to pick one of the Tiagi questions and lead that part of the discussion when we get there. And of course, we can talk about that process as well. Oh, it looks like some of these didn't get changed. Consider this. We're going to be looking at, sorry, these learning outcomes got left over from last time. I don't know why that happened, but we're going to be looking at assessments, of course, rather than theoretical frameworks. We're going to be looking at different types of intercultural assessments, the elements or aspects of assessments that we'll need to look at and examine in order to make decisions about those. And then, of course, ways to use that process to select the assessments we may want to use, or eliminate certain assessments that we may not want to use. We're going to start with our intercultural activity, talk about types and approaches of assessment, the assessment criteria, as I mentioned, and some assessment data samples. So when we get to that next step after you've collected data, and then using qualitative data and assessing that. So we're going to look at how to use a rubric to assess qualitative data to a certain extent, and then some wrap-up time at the end. Okay. So we're going to get into activity 3. And from the AAC&U Intercultural Knowledge and Competence Value rubric, we're looking at 2 competencies this time. We're looking at empathy, so intercultural empathy, which at the capstone level is interprets intercultural experience from the perspective of one's own and more than one worldview, and demonstrates ability to act in a supportive manner that recognizes the feelings of another cultural group. So the 2 primary components of intercultural empathy is the ability to access one's own and other worldviews. So how I see the world through my own perspective, but also through their perspective. That's the first part. And then the second part is being able to act supportive based on our understanding of that worldview and their feelings within this other cultural group. So that's kind of the 2 parts. Being able to access multiple worldviews and then act supportively based on that perspective. The other thing we're looking at again is cultural self-awareness. That's something we've looked at again. So again, this idea of being able to articulate insights into our own rules and biases and seeking out complexity within that, and also how these complexities have shaped us and how to recognize and respond to biases and be able to shift our self-description, be able to understand how others are perceiving us based on those things. Okay. So again, those are the capstone levels. A lot of us are going to probably be operating at a 2 or a 3, just as our students would. And that would also, if I were using this as a learning outcome with a specific competency level, I would probably aim for a 3 because I think that's a relatively easy goal to set for starting out with an activity like this. So as usual, we're going to go into breakout rooms and you're going to discuss, and I think I'm going to be able to manage groups of 3, but there might be a couple groups of 4 that we have. There's 19 of you. So that might shake out that way. We'll aim for about 10 minutes. And while you're sharing some of your hot buttons and the follow-up questions there, we want to address these 2 questions. Thinking about a specific hot button moment that you've had across cultural difference where you're interacting with someone from a different culture that was one of those hot button moments for you. Why did you feel this way? And how might your behaviors or reactions be irritating to others? So those are the 2 things we want to discuss. And again, this should also be in the Brightspace module, sub-module for Meet, if you want to pull that up and have that on your screen, or if you want to take a screenshot of this. I will also, if I can swing it, because this thing is a little tricky for me sometimes. I want to grab these out of here and put this in the chat. But of course, once you go into your breakout rooms, it won't be in the chat any longer. So you'll need to capture it out of here as I've just posted it. So that would be kind of the next step if you wanted to copy paste this out of the chat and have it with you. So why did you feel this way, and how might your behaviors or reactions have been irritating to others? So I'm going to go ahead and send this out into breakout rooms. Actually, I'm going to go ahead and aim for, some groups in 3s, maybe a few 2s. I'm going to increase the number of breakout rooms. And as usual, please start out by identifying who's going to be the volunteer for the fishbowl. And I would like everyone to have a chance to do the fishbowl. So if you've done it before, maybe mention that and move on to the next person who probably has not done the fishbowl, or hopefully has not done the fishbowl yet. So we'll keep that in mind. Okay, let's go ahead. You should see it pop up on your screen here in just a second. Just hit accept, and I will see you all back at 22 past the hour. Please let me know if you're having any trouble accessing the breakout room.
Oh, I'm so sorry. I think I hit a wrong button. Can you
That's
stop
okay.
three, please?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. That's not a problem. I'm going to move. What I have to do is move you to another room and then move you back to room 3. So
Okay,
just bear with me for a second.
sorry about that.
Okay. Should see it popping up for room 3 now. Did we lose somebody? Okay.
Yeah, I keep, there's a big thing that I keep exiting out of an error message and it keeps sending me back.
Hmm. Okay.
Okay, I'm
Let
gonna
me
try
let
and
me
then
try.
I'll just leave the obstruction there. So,
All right, let me try moving you to a different room and see if that doesn't help. Because
okay,
we do have a room that only has 2 people in it. So
okay.
recording here. So just as we've done with other activities for the fishbowl, but also in your general conversations, I failed to mention this before you went off, but I have mentioned it before. I want to remind everyone that you only need share what you're comfortable sharing, and if there's anything you're uncomfortable sharing, don't feel obligated to share that. And likewise, a reminder about how we do this in the fishbowl. We try to avoid speaking on behalf of other people. Give your perspective on things, and if you want to use an example, use primarily your own example for responses to the worksheet or that part of the discussion. However, if there was something particularly noteworthy and you want to invite that specific person to kind of turn the microphone on and share, you can do that as well. And likewise, everyone else outside of the fishbowl, just as a reminder, generally, it's just the people in the fishbowl who are going to be taking part in the conversation. However, you do have permission to interrupt and intercede and inject something that you think is valuable to the conversation. And of course, we always have the chat for that as well. So I'm just going to open this up to the conversation about if anybody would like to share one of their experiences with a hot button moment and why you felt the way you did, why it was a hot button, and how your behaviors or reactions might have been irritating to others.
I'm happy to start. So my hot button, it's actually 15 years of a hot button. I lived in France for 15 years and my husband is French. And so when living in France, one of the traits of cultural traits of French people in general is they're passive aggressive people in their conversation and so on. And it's perceived as perfectly normal among the French people. But as for myself, I would have somebody who was speaking to me formally, very formal language, but at the same time, just like passive aggressive at the same time in their discourse. And that it was just something that drove me. I didn't know how to handle it in the beginning because I would talk to my husband. He didn't see it. He's French. For him, it was perfectly normal. And I always thought friends were angry at me because of how they were saying things. But then it took me a long time to get that figured out and kind of get past it. And that especially when I was going to the bank or something like that, and they would say, you think they're there to help you, but in their discourse, you felt like that they weren't wanting to help you. So how did I handle it? Basically, I had to understand that it was part of the culture, and I'm the one who had to take a breath. I couldn't change all the French people. So every time I would just have to take a breath and say, okay, they're not attacking me. They're not attacking me. And it was kind of interesting that afterwards we moved to the United States, and my husband, we've been here for 15 years, and now my husband sees it. And so among the French people. It's just something, it's still, every time I go back to France, I still get the same, but I'm just like, nope, take a breath. It's part of their culture and they're not attacking me.
I'm messing up technology. And thank you, Heather, for sharing that. That's a really great example. Yeah, it's oftentimes the only way to deal with hot button issues is acknowledge this is a thing that's kind of triggering me. I need to remind yourself, this is a cultural difference. I don't need to fix this. There's nothing wrong with me. It's just a difference. So, and that can be, if that is the solution, that can be frustrating, but we often say that we need to practice being comfortable with being uncomfortable.
I can add something.
Please.
In our group, without stepping on anyone, some of our issues were not things that are very visible when you see someone. So if like the example we just had of a different nationality or a different gender or different ethnic background or something, that's you just see that from the start. Well, a couple of them, including mine, is kind of invisible, which is sort of a offbeat sense of humor that doesn't matter, different nation or different color, doesn't matter. It's just going to come out. And my wife giving me the elbow that they just don't get that, or she has to make some kind of comment that's just Rob's sense of humor. So that's, to me, that was kind of interesting. A couple of us brought that up, these kind of invisible cultural things.
Thanks,
Yeah.
Rob. That's really great. Go ahead, Karen.
Unspoken. Oh, no, I was like those unspoken rules or those unspoken things. I thought one of the cool things about my group was I know what I was like, oh my gosh, I struggled with it. I was like, hot button, like hot. I know they exist, but I just really struggled to figure out, is this really a hot button issue? But I was in Italy for a conference and just flown in. It had been a long journey and a long day, and so I get checked in and I just want to walk around because I like visiting local places and just trying to experience that part. And I went to a restaurant and they sat me down, but there was like no menu, no nothing, and so I didn't think anything of it. And then it was just kind of like, what do you want? And it was like a menu, like, is there, what do you want? Pasta? Like what, like, and so there was just like, I was going to get pasta. And then what do you want to drink? And I was like, water and a Coke Zero? No, wine. Like they were like, it was just like, this is what you're going to have. And this is what you're going to do. And then that kind of led to some other discussions where we were talking about like the hospitality and just the nature of a lot of different cultures. Like hospitality is really, really important. And so a lot of cultures, it's about sharing their love of you or their love with food, and they want to give you food and they want to give you drinks, and you're full and you're just like, I can't, but if you don't, like, it feels like you may offend someone, or maybe they'll understand, but then sometimes maybe they don't. And so that also hospitality seemed to be like interpreting what just we could be annoyed because it's just like, I just want to be by myself for a second, or they're just like, no, we're just trying to help you. So it's kind of the hospitality miscommunication.
Yeah, Karen, that's a great example. It reminds me of, there's a scene in a film I watched recently with these two men walk into a diner, and this is somewhere in Texas, and the waitress says, "What don't you want?" And after a lot of confusion, she finally explains, "You can order two things. Which one do you not want?"
Well, it actually reminded me of, has anybody ever been to like the Billy Goat in Chicago? And it's like cheeseburger. And it's just like, you're going to get a cheeseburger and don't ask for fries. There's only chips, like that, like, those types of
the unwritten rules, right? Yeah. And it also reminds me that, American culture, we actually, we're so used to it. We grow up with it. It's normal. But we have a kind of a unique relationship with the service industry. The notion of tipping is quite foreign to a lot of nationalities. They're like, what do you mean don't they get a paycheck? Why am I paying them money? And also, why are they coming and asking me if I need anything every 5 minutes? Right. In most of Europe, they'll ask you what you want when you're seated. They might come back and take your order, and then that's it. They drop off the food and you might not see them again. You have to chase them down if you want the check. It's different. And yeah, a lot of times the expectations that we struggle with is, oh, you should just know this stuff because everybody else does. So yeah, there's a couple categories that commonly come up for hot buttons. Number one is rudeness. What we perceive as rudeness. Oh, that was rude. Someone was overly direct, or passive aggressive, as Heather puts it. So what we perceive as rudeness, and for a lot of our students, getting them to kind of wrap their minds around the fact that rudeness is culturally bound. We define rudeness completely based on cultural ideals. Politeness being the opposite is, of course, those cultural definitions. Directness and indirectness we've talked about already. Inefficiency can kind of trigger some of us that, man, just get to the point, just do the thing we're here to do, and not, I don't want to hear your whole life story about how your grandmother's doing right now. But if you're in a culture where relationship is a high priority and timeliness less so, that can definitely be a trigger. Or just a lack of timeliness in general, of having different definitions of what on time versus late means. But then we have the very typical ones of just being annoyed by things, certain sounds, or odd behaviors or practices that are just completely foreign to us, that may just kind of hit that nerve for us. And then my other all-time favorite one is when I have to go to foreign countries and deal with bureaucracy or hierarchy. That can also be a trigger. It's like, let me really build up my stamina before I go into the situation. So
I want to add,
yes, please go ahead, Krista.
I just wanted to add a little bit about what our group, because it was very interesting that we sort of coalesced on the same experiences. And so the two themes were time, the concept of time, and the second was role of women and how women are perceived in a different culture. And so I feel like that's important to discuss, because when it comes to timing, if I say, let's meet at 12 and then you come at 1, I'm thinking, what happened? Did we cancel this? And whereas that might be actually the showing, favor to the hostess for giving time to get the event set up, right? So there's that other side of the equation. So it's trying to balance what is that expectation of what time is, or that appointment. And then the role of women, of course, well, we know that there are strong cultural differences. And so we spoke about Japan in particular. I happened to be in Japan, and it was very interesting for these group events that women weren't allowed to go to them. However, I was invited. So I was the only woman on this whole big event. And so it's very uncomfortable. So, that was uncomfortable to be in a place where, typically that wouldn't be part of the expected experience. So, I also felt honored. I'm like, I really get an inside view into what's going on here, and how that's pretty amazing that I had that opportunity.
Yeah, thank you, Kristen. Thanks for sharing that one.
I just want to add, that's our group brought up, that's different from what's already been said, is how others perceive Americans, and the I guess some of the stereotyping that goes on when we're in a foreign country when they find out you're an American.
Right, absolutely. And I always love to point this out with my students, is be prepared for that. It's going to happen. But it's also a great learning moment for them to have the realizations like, oh, they probably hate it when I do that to them here, right here in the US. Because it happens to our international students all the time too. Yeah, so that's a little taste of our own medicine sometimes, which can be good for us. But yeah, that's definitely a hot button. I can't tell you how many times I've, felt a little bit exhausted at trying to defend my government's politics, when it's like, I didn't even vote for the guy. I totally agree with you. I'm not happy with this either, but I still feel like I'm in a position where I have to defend everything. So that's definitely can be a hot button for a lot of people. How about behaviors? And I'll still leave this open if you want to address the hot buttons for you. But I do also want to spend a little bit of time talking about things that we do when we're abroad that may be a hot button for others. But Jody, you wanted to say something?
Well, I just wanted to follow up on the gender comment, because that's one thing that I mentioned is people being dismissive on gender grounds. And I had a very specific incident in 1999 in India. I traveled there with 4 of my colleagues, 2 females, 2 males, one of whom was my husband, which is an important part of this story. And we were befriended by an auto rickshaw driver who invited us all over to his home for dinner. So it was a great opportunity. As part of the dinner conversation, he asked us what we had enjoyed about India. What was the thing we enjoyed most? And so my 4 colleagues in turn answered his question, and then he cut off the dialogue. He didn't ask me. And of course, my colleagues all jumped in. Hey, wait a minute, you didn't ask her opinion. And he said, well, I already asked her husband. So it would be considered rude to my husband if he had asked my opinion. And I might have had a different opinion. So it was a very interesting situation. And, I guess we probably were a little irritating to him. Everybody was protesting loudly, but it was a great experience to tell my students about when I went back home, because I was teaching a course on Indian history and culture. So it was a great experience. But as far as the question you asked, behaviors that might be irritating, interestingly enough, I think Brenda and I had the same thing, is that we're quite introverted. And anyone who's introverted knows that it often gets misconstrued as snobbery or disinterest. And so it can be a little annoying to people who are the outgoing types, who never struggle in social situations, who always feel free to speak up. But interestingly enough, Todd in our group, he comes from a really loud, happy, outgoing, loving family, whereas his wife's family was a little more reserved. But he thought maybe the thing people might find interesting about, or irritating about him, perhaps interesting too, irritating about him, is he's a little loud sometimes. So we had kind of polar opposites in our group on that. So
Thank you, Jody. That's really a great point. Yeah.
We just could only touch briefly on the irritation factor. And the only thing that really came to mind is really about food. And if you had food preference and food choice, I mean, we kind of already hinted at and discussed it, but that was what we had discussed. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Kristen. I'm often reminded, one of the things that comes up a lot with my friends in Germany, their complaints about American tourists, very loud. We go out to restaurants and bars and we tend to just take over, at least in volume. And maybe what is manspreading in the kind of verbal sense of kind of taking over the whole room with our boisterousness. And I don't know if you all have come across this in the news. This summer apparently has had quite a few incidents in Europe with American tourists misbehaving and doing some kind of rude things like defacing historical monuments and just generally, disregarding kind of respectful expectations around some of those tourist attractions. A woman filling her water bottle on the Trevi Fountain, for example, and a young American tourist etching he and his girlfriend's initials into the Colosseum, one of the bricks there. That was even things I think by our own standards would be kind of rude, but those are extreme examples.
That reminds me of the people that go to national parks and get too close to the wildlife. I don't know if it's the same thing culturally, but it feels like it.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is also a good reminder that when we're traveling abroad, it's not always going to be the locals that trigger our hot buttons. It could be other Americans that trigger our hot buttons as well. And with that in mind, this activity was primarily created to assist students who are going to be bunked together while traveling abroad. Here's your partner. You're going to be stuck with them for a week. Let's get all the hot button issues discussed and out in the open before we leave the country. And hopefully we can avoid some problems down the road. So some intended learning outcomes from this activity. I already mentioned self-awareness and empathy, but another one is emotional resilience. So part of emotional resilience is acknowledging and managing emotional reactions to stress triggers. And so identifying what those triggers are and coming up with strategies for dealing with them or avoiding them can be very important. So this activity can help address that as well. So literally, let's talk about things that might annoy you before they annoy you. So we're nice and calm now, but when you get triggered, you may not be able to maintain your control and might lose your temper. So let's try to come up with some strategies ahead of time. Okay.
I had a question
Yes,
about
Krista.
that, because that seems very interesting. Are you bringing the activity like into the pre-meetings, or when do you expect the activity to happen?
Yeah, this particular activity, the hot button activity, I would do as a pre-departure activity, especially if you are going to pair your students together to share rooms and you might assign that ahead of time. This would be a great activity to do with those assignments and say, fill this out, meet with your room partner or partners. Sometimes you're in a room of 4, and share your hot buttons. Talk about things that annoy you. Talk about, if you're more introverted or extroverted, and how might your behaviors annoy other people, and come up with some strategies, or even like code words, like grapefruit. This is one of my hot buttons. And okay, we agreed when somebody says grapefruit, we're going to stop what we're doing. And, whether it's like tapping a pen while you're writing and doing an assignment or something, or, listening to music too loudly, even on headphones, because we can still hear sometimes those. But yeah, I would do it as a pre-departure activity. And this can be really helpful to avoid some of those problems.
Can I ask a question, Dan? Follow-up question on that. Do you suggest us to do that in-person pre-departure, or most people do online departure meetings?
It's really up to you on your specific context. So an activity like hot buttons, at the very least, I would like the students to meet face-to-face to go over the worksheet. So even if you were saying assigning this via Brightspace or distributing it via email, whatever the case may be, you might be in an online setting, but I would encourage the students to meet face-to-face to share their worksheets and discuss them.
Okay.
But of course they could do that in a Zoom call too.
Okay. For the worksheets and also these activities, can we copy some of those from this course, or do you provide support for us to put on Brightspace?
Absolutely. You can certainly copy any of this information from this course, and we're actually going to look at the digital toolbox soon in this workshop, and explore ways to pull activities out of that. So that's a possibility as well. Okay. I do have one other. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off, Lee. Did you have any other follow-ups?
No, thank you.
Okay. I'm going to go back to sharing my screen, because before we get out of the fishbowl, one last thing I do want to do, I'm going to share my screen here again, is get to the Tiagi debrief. And so I'll start with volunteers in the fishbowl. If you'd like to pick one of these 6 questions, and I've even put a sub question under number 5. So if you really wanted to cheat, you could have the one that's already kind of been formulated for you. But I welcome any volunteers that would like to kind of get the ball rolling and talking about at least 3 of these 6 questions.
Well, I'll talk about how do you feel.
Mm-hmm.
So I felt like doing this activity actually was very enlightening because I didn't realize the shared experiences with my group, that we had a similar experiences and similar feelings. And so just thinking about, is that feeling actually like related to my cultural upbringing, or is it an emotional feeling, right? It's like, how does it tie in? And one of the outcomes for me was thinking, I don't really reflect on how fortunate and I am to be in my own culture, or what my culture has given to me as a woman and my opportunities. So that was something that came out of the discussion. And yeah, I felt actually made my day very positive because of this conversation.
Great. Thank you, Kristen. And would anybody like to choose one of these to kind of lead some conversation around one of these questions?
Yeah, I'd like to. I feel like I didn't share a whole lot during the fishbowl, so I'd like to ask everybody what you learned. And I can start if anybody wants to chime in after me. I learned that it is a very common thing, at least within my group, to care very much about whether or not what we are telling people goes anywhere else. That was kind of the number one thing, is like trust is a really big thing. Trust and respectful communication. And so hopefully we'll be able to cultivate that for our students using these methods.
Great. Anyone else on what you learned?
And is the idea that we're responding to each other and to develop, is that what we're doing here in the
Yeah,
developing?
so sorry, and I apologize if I'm not been clear on this. As we're doing these activities, especially in future workshops, I want to give everyone an opportunity to kind of practice using some of these questions in the discussion. So definitely responding yourself, just as both you and Kelsey did, but also asking the question to the group and kind of facilitating that portion of the conversation.
Okay,
So-
okay, let me try again. So I already did it. So what did anybody else learn from this activity? Any like big takeaways? Should I name drop? Should I call on people? That's what I would do to my students. That's what I would do to them. Suzanne?
I knew you were going to do that, Kelsey.
Sorry.
That's what we get when we work together.
Yep.
I would say something I learned. It's that we had a lot of experiences that were similar and not exactly the same. Some of my experiences were in the US, others were international. A lot of what people shared, all of you shared in the fishbowl, were the same things we talked about. So I think when I did this activity or read about like the hot buttons, it kind of scares me, right? When you're like, oh, what's your hot button activity? And now if someone says this is your hot button, now I got to make sure not to click my pen every 5 minutes or whatever, right? Because I don't want to irritate someone else. But having these discussions and we're all kind of talking around the same points. So I think it's healthy. We can call it a hot button. You don't want to irritate someone else, but then you realize we kind of all have them. So maybe it's a really great way to bring that out. I guess that's what I'd like to share.
Thank you. I appreciate you letting me call you out.
No problem.
I'll call myself out. So my thing was the sense of humor, off-the-wall sense of humor. And, as I explained in our group, part of it is a kind of my attempt to stand out and not be just the, part of the background or the wallpaper or something like that, but to be just to be unique. I mean, it used to be, we had kids and we still have kids, but when they were young, they were all so different. And part of it is that, if the first one is introverted, the next one is going to be maybe extroverted, just to be noticed. I can't be identical to my brother, or I'll be kind of indistinguishable from my brother. So I'll be different this way. And so I think I kind of developed this behavior. And I don't know, we don't want to get too much into the TMI, you know, of ourselves here, I guess. But it made me wonder, well, maybe that's not cool. Maybe it's not appreciated by other, because a lot of us we have these behaviors and we think that makes us appreciated, that we take charge or we do this thing. We speak up when nobody else speaks up. Well, maybe it's not appreciated, not cool. So I mean, I learned just in the past half hour about a little, being reflective on, maybe I hadn't been reflective enough before.
I think, Rob, though, like, I appreciate people like that. I like the kooky, the weirdos, the ones with the odd sense of humor that, like, break up the day a little bit. I feel like so many of us are constantly, we're existing within bureaucratic structures and systems that just want to suck the soul out of us with all of the paperwork and the forms and and so whenever someone comes along and says something stupid, or at least said something, silly or remarkable, I mean, I appreciate it. So I don't know. I feel like I trust the people who are close to me to call me out if I'm crossing lines or boundaries. And I know there's a self-reflective component of making sure that you're not triggering people's hot button issues. But at the same time, I think we're all, and especially our students, are so afraid. They're on eggshells. At least my students are all the time. They just want to make friends, right? They just want to find meaning and tell stories together and get along. And I feel like we're all on eggshells. So I don't know. I appreciate the weirdos.
So you and I would get along fine in the history department, but the other people, other people wouldn't.
Are you in the history department?
I was, so we talked about that last time. You were a history major.
Yeah, we did this already. Okay, so Rob and I are the weird ones.
Yeah.
Okay, got it.
Make a note of that. Okay.
I just think it's interesting because, like, I mean, just within this fishbowl and then within our breakout groups, the issue is that we're all, I mean, there's this this struggle because of those unwritten rules, right? And unwritten rules exist everywhere. And so we're bound sometime to offend and be offended. And I don't think that is I don't think that is where we're wrong. I think where we're wrong is when we neglect to take those moments of reflection within that community or within that opportunity and go, oh, well, obviously this is that unwritten rule. Maybe I did this, but maybe I just was too sensitive. So this is just how this works when I'm in this situation. And I think that, like, I mean, I don't want Rob to change. I don't want Kelsey to change, but I know when I am a type A, timing is huge for me. I don't, I need to keep that schedule going, and I need to And so when I go to Greece, when I take my students to Greece, I have to like shift down, like because nothing is on time. It is a very relaxed stuff flowing. And then I get used to that. And then I come back here and I'm like, oh, wait, I live here. Okay. So I think the opportunities, it's that we hope that we're all in a safe place, yet if it happens where we're not in that safe place, then we just we don't hold it against them that, that's maybe something that we've done, if that makes any sense at all.
Absolutely. Thank you, Karen. Yeah.
Well, I think it makes, not to dominate the conversation, but I mean, it makes total sense. But, Dan has created these guidelines that this is a safe place, and, you can be the awkward one or the nerdy one or the funny one or the whatever one. And we're all okay with that. That is not the real world. When you step outside of this group, they don't have those rules, and especially when you go overseas or you go into some, if I was to go into, Chinatown, USA, I would be, I think there's a sensitivity that's kind of required out there for.
Absolutely. So I'm already hearing, I'm really enjoying this conversation because I'm already hearing the self-awareness and the empathy coming out. Of course, our students may struggle with this a little bit more than this particular group, but it is gratifying to hear the learning outcomes being met in this conversation. I want to get to number 5. What if, could this exercise better increase individual empathy or group harmony with students? I'd like to hear your thoughts on that. And again, with that context of using this with your own students ahead of going abroad.
I think it could, and I think I'm going to be ruminating a lot for a long time on what the example that you shared, actually, Heather, about living in France for 15 years. And as you were telling your story, I was gearing up. I was like, yeah, I'm so ready. Like, what'd you do? What'd you tell those pompous French people? Like, put them in their place. And then you're like, I reflected that I was living in France. And I was like, that's the whole lesson right there. Right. So I think that was like just a perfect example of how this can increase group harmony and individual.
Thanks, Kelsey.
I really did. I love that story. It was such a good story.
I think it's interesting because, now that we're living in the United States and my husband lives with me, Rob, I don't know, you remember Laurent, don't you? We used to do, when we were in the wine tasting group.
Yeah, I do
Yeah.
remember Laurent. Thank you.
So it took me a minute. I kept looking at Krishuval. I'm like, Linda, is this Rob? Like,
Yeah.
Linda's Rob? Okay.
Yeah,
So,
here we are. Wow, that's because, well, we'll talk offline.
yeah, we can talk offline.
It's like,
but
where's the wine tasting group? What
it kind of COVID, it kind of dissolved. So
But it was cool when it was alive.
It was fun. And my husband's a lot of fun. He's one that's kind of, he's the life of the party and everything. However, so I lived, in France for 15 years, and now he's been in the United States for 15 years. And he doesn't, 15 years in, he still doesn't get the social cues, he is like, I'm a Frenchman. I will be a Frenchman until I die. And this is how I am. And I'm not changing for anyone. And I'm not, I don't care about the, what American culture is about, even though he's adopted some of it. But I see he doesn't reflect on anything. He'll be like, this is just how I am. And either people accept me or they don't. And so I was talking to Wei about personal space. He'll get up in somebody's face to talk to him, and he thinks that he's being friendly. Whereas an American, all they do is back up. And I've told him over and over and over again, I'm just like, you know what, he'll just figure, one of these days he'll understand when somebody backs up and, falls off the steps because they've backed up so far from him. But then he'll say it's their fault for backing up. But so it's kind of interesting because I see, this comes back with this exercise, better increase individual empathy or group harmony with students. It depends on the individual. For me, it just depends. I think it just depends. You can have a group of 15 people and 10 people will come to understand what we're looking for, and 5 of them won't. So you can't expect everybody to react the same way in the same situation. So that was the whole point of my story and my thoughts.
Thank you, Heather. Yeah, that's really good. Great point. And really this question gets to as well, what do you want to emphasize with this activity? Do you want to focus more on helping your students work on their individual empathy, or is your concern about, okay, we're going abroad and everybody's going to be sharing a room and I want everyone to get along as best they can, so let's focus on group harmony, and maybe some individual empathy will come out of that through exercising this. But yeah, it could be just a matter of what you want to emphasize in your program. So yeah, I have a small world. I think, we have Christian Butzka is going through IPG, and he is our, wine course professor. So maybe we should get him involved and get that restarted. I do want to go on to the next part, and I'll invite everyone back from the outside the fishbowl to think about the pedagogical debrief. how might you use this activity with students? We've talked about that a little bit with using as pre-departure, especially if you're assigning groups together or even just teamwork, not necessarily rooming together. Practical administrative considerations, anything pop up with using an activity like this? And again, this is open to everybody.
I think it's, great practical administrative application. Just like you said, who wants to put two people in a room who don't like each other are going to be oil and water or something like that. So let's get this stuff out of the way early, and forewarned is forearmed, kind of.
So the nice thing about activities like hot buttons, it's a worksheet, and there's a lot of pretty easy to distribute those and have students they know how to fill out worksheets, right? There's not a lot of extra prep or instruction for this. Where do you consider the points for learning empathy, self-awareness, emotional resilience? Is it in the activity itself or in the debriefing component?
Is this the question open for anyone?
Yes. Yeah.
I think that this is more or less in the debrief slash reflection, or however that particular participant processes and reflects. So for some that can be instant, for others that could be 5 years down the line. We all have those students that, they look like they didn't pay attention in class, and we think that we didn't get through them. And then you may get an email like, oh my gosh, wow, you actually were paying attention. Maybe it wasn't cool to pay attention. I don't know. Something along those lines. I've had that experience before.
Yeah. Thanks, Jen. I think a lot of us have had those students. I think I was one of those students, actually. So I think from the time that I've used this, I see the self-awareness coming up in the worksheet portion as they're filling it out. Like, oh, yeah, those things do bother me as they're filling it out. And then they start to think about, and when it gets to the questions about things you do that may bother other people, it's kind of bringing those things to the surface. And that comes up again in the conversations when it gets to the part where the students are having their small group discussions. And then the empathy part and the emotional resilience part comes from developing strategies and being aware of how we're interacting with people. They might push our buttons, we might push theirs. That hopefully fosters some of that empathy as well. And that can be in the activity and the debrief and reflection part. Absolutely. Any final thoughts on this one? I do want to be mindful we're already at 7 after, and we've got a few things to get through, but I do want to offer any final thoughts. Okay. Thanks again to everyone in the fishbowl and for trying out the Tiagi debrief, asking some of those questions. I appreciate you all doing that. But let's get on into some assessment tools. Many of you I've already met with to have individual debriefs, or at the very least, you've taken that assessment for a test drive, just as the students would. So we can do a show of hands, or just have this be a general question to think about. Are there any of you out there who feel like you know nothing about assessment tools? Like, I give my students tests and quizzes, but don't ask me the pedagogical impact or how we can use these in different settings. Does anyone feel kind of like this is a foreign language talking about assessment tools? Okay, maybe this means everyone feels like, oh, I'm okay with this. This is not that odd or foreign. How about using different intercultural tools? And I'll open it up this way. Any of the ones that we've done as the test drive, if anybody wants to share, if you've done more than one intercultural tool, what might have those been? Who's done 2 or more intercultural assessments? Jen
Yeah.
and Heather?
Yeah, I've used, the main one that I've used is the IDI.
And let me pick on you, Heather. What are some advantages and disadvantages of the IDI as you see them?
Well, as I see it, when I took the assessment myself, every question that I answered, well, not every, but almost everything for me was, it depends. It depends. And so, I actually had to do some thinking about it, because I would look at it from a French perspective or an American perspective. Those are the two cultures that I think of, or Midwestern culture, I should say. And I said, but in the end, when I reflected on it, I was like, it really doesn't depend on what lens I'm looking at it from. What I should be looking at is what's happening in the scenario. And so for me, at the beginning, when I was first learning about this and did the assessment, I didn't really agree with, and I still to this day don't understand how they come up with where the person is on the spectrum. I still don't quite understand it. So it's difficult for me to explain that to a student. I can explain where they are in the spectrum, but I don't know why compared to how they responded to questions. So that's kind of how I see the disadvantage, because I can't necessarily answer because I don't see how they answer the questions.
Right. Yeah, that definitely, when there is some mystery or the black box, there's like, how does this work? Not knowing that can definitely be a disadvantage, and can also, that can affect your confidence in the results, right? Yeah.
But the advantage is that I think it's pretty comprehensive. And when I have the discussion, the debrief with the students, I can actually see why they are where they are. I get it in when we work on doing a deeper dive into it and how they're responding to the questions that I'm asking them, to get more information. It's like, oh yeah, okay, now I see why they are there. I still can't answer why, how they answered each question, because that comes up all the time. They're like, well, can we see our response? What's right? What they want to know is what's right, what's wrong.
Yeah.
There is no right and wrong in this.
Right.
It is. So, yeah.
And just to clarify, in case anyone is maybe confused, we're talking about the intercultural development inventory. And then we're going to look at some of these things a little bit more in depth in our time remaining. And so just for the sake of time, I'm going to skip over some of these questions, but thank you, Heather, for bringing that one up. It's a great example to kind of get the ball rolling. And we're going to talk about some of these considerations. So different types of assessment. So how you can use assessment of learning, for learning, as learning. I think most of us are most familiar with summative assessment, using it to measure what learning took place, right? To the extent to which our students grasp these concepts. For learning, I often recommend, for example, the Ask-To, if you want to use the pre-version of that as a way to introduce the intercultural knowledge and competence value rubric. You can use that assessment to begin that conversation. So it's for learning, so it facilitates learning in other areas. But also you can use it as a pedagogical tool. The assessment can itself be a learning tool. And I do feel that way with the IDI, especially the debriefing component, which is a requirement of the IDI. So it goes hand in hand with the assessment. Survey part itself is the debrief part is just as important. Different approaches to assessment. So there's holistic versus component. So the IDI would be one of those assessment that is more of a holistic assessment. So it's measuring generally the mindset of people and how they develop intercultural mindsets. Whereas something like the Ask-To, that's based on the AAC&U intercultural knowledge and competence value rubric, it's measuring specifically, these two prompts are about openness. These two prompts are about curiosity. These two prompts are specifically about verbal, nonverbal communication. So two different approaches to assessing, holistically or component. And then you have direct versus indirect measures. The IDI is definitely a bit more indirect, and it's asking you to think about specific circumstances, and then it's measuring based on your responses. To Heather's point about the it depends, I had the same experience, and a lot of people have that same experience. You're asked kind of a vague general, you're given a vague or general scenario, and then you're asked what your response would be and kind of a multiple choice. And the it depends part is you have to fill in the blank with your own context in order to answer the question. And that's kind of how the assessment bases its response on what is your framing of that kind of vague one that leads to the type of response you might have. Whereas, again, the ask is more directly, it's saying, do you do this thing? But also, the IDI calculates a score and tells you kind of where you are in this continuum, whereas the IDI, there is no calculation. It's just the responses. And you can look at the responses and realize, okay, I've ranked myself high or low in a particular competency area. Quantitative versus qualitative assessments. So quantitative would be things like the IDI and the ask, where you get numerical data and you can look at pre-post, and this score is lower than this score or in this area. So that's one way to measure that. But qualitative, and this goes back to a more direct measure, if you were to use the rubric itself to look at student essays and parse out, okay, this specific sentence or phrase here is an example of the student's curiosity. And then what is it about that phrase or statement that I can tie directly into the description of a particular competency level or proficiency level, excuse me. So that would be a direct measure, but that would also be how we do qualitative assessment of coding phrases and statements from an essay, from longer form text, to find out where students are within a theoretical model or framework. And then, of course, we have aspects like high versus low face validity. And face validity is just the extent to which you can look at an assessment and know a particular question or statement or prompt, what it is specifically asking about. So asks, for example, the ask to asking a question about curiosity. If you know the rubric, you can look at that statement and go, oh, this is obviously asking a question about intercultural curiosity. And that's what we mean by high face validity. Low face validity would be, it's much more ambiguous what the question is trying to target. So we do have a worksheet. This is a snippet from this worksheet. There's a little bit more information with some hyperlinks and stuff in here, but these are different criteria that we might look at when we're trying to evaluate an assessment tool. Is this something I want to use? So what's the medium that the assessment is provided in? So these are downloadable PDFs for the value rubrics, the 16 different value rubrics, the BEVI, Beliefs, Events, Values Inventory. These are, this is a web-based survey, as is the intercultural intelligence quotient, the CQ, and then the IDI, also web-based, IES is web-based, but the ask to, I've created a Qualtrics version out of that. I'm happy to share that, by the way, so you don't have to reinvent the wheel, but it's primarily a paper-based where you would print it out and distribute it. That was its original format. How long it is, so giving an idea of how many questions within a Likert scale, face validity, if it is high or low, the cost associated with this is always a big factor for everyone. Do you have a budget to pay for assessments, or do you need to look for one of these that's free? So the value rubrics, the ask, those are free. The BEVI, that we have an institutional license, so you can get the BEVI through Silmar. But the cost is there is a fee with it. So we have an annual license, but there's a fee. I'm not as familiar with the BEVI, but my colleagues in the office use it quite frequently. And I think the IDI, the cost here has gone up. I think $1 each on that, saying 13 per student, and I think 19 or maybe even 20 for non-students. The IDI was originally created to be used in professional settings in corporations, so they have a tiered pricing system. Does it require a debrief? So with the IDI, in order to get your individual scores, you have to have an individual debrief, but you also need to do, if you're not doing an individual debrief, you need to do a group debrief. And that gives you a group average and a distribution percentages for each of the orientations. But it does require a debrief. And along with that, do you need special training in order to do it? Now, certainly with the rubrics and the Ask To, you don't need special training, or you don't need to pay to be trained, but it would probably be helpful to have someone go over it with you how to do it. But aside from that, anyone can have that conversation, learn it. Whereas some of these require, like the IDI, the training for the IDI is 2.5 days. I think they've changed it now. I think it's 2 half days broken up. And yeah, I think it's $1,600 to go through the training to be a qualified administrator. So things like with the IDI, if you're not a QA, you have to get a QA to order the assessment for you, help you retrieve the results, and also doing the group debriefs or an individual debriefs that would have to be provided by a QA as well. And then what are the things it's measuring? That information is provided here as well. So this would be a good point for me to very briefly show you all the hub, and specifically the intercultural, the digital toolbox, where you can find a lot of this information. So bear with me just a second while I pull this up. So I've shared this with many of you already. It's hubicl.org. You're not required to have an account, register an account with them to access the spaces in the hub. However, if you want to contribute to anything, and of course in IPG, you're being asked to contribute something, so you will need to register an account. It is free. It's run by the Center for Intercultural Learning. We're not going to share your information with anybody out, your personal registration information. So hopefully you have confidence in that we're not going to share that information with others for marketing purposes or anything like that. When you go in, there's these 4 kind of navigation items here at the top, and you want to go to Discover. And the second option is Digital Toolbox. And within the Digital Toolbox, it's going to start out by just listing things alphabetically, but you can narrow the search by group size. If you're looking for a tool that has a complete lesson plan with it or not, and whether or not it has an external cost associated with it. And so a lot of these assessments do have an external cost, approximately how long you want it to be. So thinking about activities, for example, do you want an icebreaker? So you might want something that's 20 minutes or less, or you might want a full class activity. So you might want something that's 50 to 60 minutes. And then of course, tool type is the different types of tools in here. So if we wanted to look at assessments, we could click on that one. Kinesthetic, that's specifically if it's something in the activity or the assessment that they have to get up and move around, or they have to physically manipulate something, pick something up, move something in order to complete the task, that would be kinesthetic. Most things are probably not kinesthetic. But if I wanted to, for example, find an assessment on self-awareness, I could narrow that search. And of course, there's still a lot of assessment tools in here that you can explore. And some of them have lesson plans with them, and they give you approximate times. So when you get in to look at a particular assessment tool, there's additional information, what the learning objectives are. And of course, self-awareness is built in. I think it's in some of this other information here, but there are downloads for this. So there's PDFs explaining the rubric, links to the external website, both for the IDC and an update for this one. Some additional materials. This is usually what you might need to facilitate this with students. So sometimes you might make sure you bring extra paper or bring extra pens. That kind of information would be provided here. And then any additional notes that people who've used this before might provide some notes about things they learned from using it that might be helpful. And then also related tools can point to other things within the digital toolbox that might pair well with this particular tool. And then finally, the reviews, that's one you guys are going to be engaging with later on when you're ready to write a review of something. And then there's additional information about the theoretical frameworks that are included here. So self-awareness, openness, and empathy from the AAC&U rubric. But then also this is really good for really any level of the IDI. And it's also good for friendship, teamwork, mentorship, leadership, and diversity, equity, inclusion. Not so much for emotional resilience. So there's some additional information there as well. Citation sources, hyperlinks, those sorts of things are also provided. So there's a lot of different ways. There's even an advanced search feature within this where you can narrow it down to some of these other looking specifically within frameworks for the IDI. So if you know your students are majority polarization minimization, you might want to focus on activities that target those two areas. So that's some things to think about as well. So it's going in a deeper kind of dive into the search features within these categories here. So you can go in and find assessments this way, but you can also, we're also going to be using it to look for activities. Any questions connected to the hub? Okay, and again, this won't be the last time we talk about the hub and take a look at the digital toolbox. So I do want to touch on a few other things. I mentioned one of the things to talk about is the different type of data that we might gather from some of these assessments. So here's an example of using the AAC&U Intercultural Knowledge and Competence Value rubric. So this was where these students received no training on the rubric and specifically in curiosity, self-awareness, or openness. But in the following year, these students did receive training, and we saw a great increase in that proficiency level, rubric level 3 or above, which was measured here. So that's one example using the AAC&U rubric. This is kind of what the results look like for the bevy. So you have different categories, and this is only a portion of the different categories that are provided. The bevy goes into a lot of detail, but then it gives these kind of percentage averages in each of the kind of question categories. So you have a broad category, these kind of competencies underneath of this category, and then what the individual breakdown is for your group of students. This was a study that I did using the IDI. We're at a control group that had no intercultural training. I had a group that received individual one-on-one mentoring through their intercultural course. And then this group was larger groups with one mentor receiving group training. And then I broke down the pre-post comparisons into the yellow being stasis, what we would consider no change from pre to post. And then the blue being regression. So regressing one whole stage or regressing 2 whole stages, and then progress or growth. So 1 stage, 2 stage, 3 stage, and even 4 stages of growth, which was quite interesting to see with these group of students. And so this was multiple semesters all compiled together. Again, if you wanted to do qualitative assessment, you might look at student essays, long text responses, and you could focus either prescriptively. These are my learning outcomes for this, and so I'm only going to look at the texts for self-awareness and worldview frameworks. And you would comb through each student's response and find those specific statements that align with self-awareness and with worldview. And then as you underline or code each one, you would then try to place them at a particular proficiency level. And you could do that with a pre-essay and a post-essay, especially if you ask the same question in the pre and the post to look for, did they go from an average of a number 2 up to an average of a number 3? So that's also something you could do as a form of assessment. So thoughts on selecting and finding appropriate assessments for your program. Does anybody have some thoughts they want to share or questions? And I've heard from some of you about this next question, how you might use assessments. Is anybody planning on using their assessment as in kind of that example of the ask to pre-assessment, using that for learning to kind of get the conversation started around the rubric And while you're mulling that over, I have an animal that's making a lot of noise. Apologies for that. Is anyone planning on doing the 4 assessment approach? I'm sorry, the 4 learning approach with the assessment? Seeing some nodding. Thank you, Ashley. So, especially with those of you who did the Ask To that I've already debriefed of, I've already had this conversation. The Ask is kind of a unique, at least what we recommend people do, but there's a lot of assessments similar to the Ask that I would also recommend the same approach. And that is, we have a pre-test version. The problem with the pre-test version is the nature of the assessment. Students are responding to the assessment from a position of ignorance. And so accuracy of their responses becomes a real problem with that particular type of assessment, where they're self-reporting on their ability to do some of these things in different competency areas. So we actually recommend what's called a post-retro pre, and that is you give the assessment twice only at the end of the program. You can do the pre, but that kind of becomes optional. And if you want to use it for learning, but not for summative. If you want to do summative to measure the learning, we recommend doing a post, which is a standard post, but then a retro pre is they answer the questions again, but they assess themselves not as they are now, but who they were prior to the beginning of the course. So assess your past self as you go through this assessment. And that tends to get much more accurate results because now they're answering from a position of knowledge. They're familiar with what these competencies are, and they know that they've learned something. So that's one thing to consider when administering an assessment. Okay, I want to note that we are just at the end of our time. I want to remind everyone, next steps, be sure to go back to the post-workshop reflection in module 3. And if you have time, explore some of those resources that are there. There's some, I believe, some videos about some of the different assessments. So some kind of explanations and descriptions if you're curious about some of those. And of course, begin working on the next module as well. Thank you all for your time today. I'll stick around as usual for a few extra minutes if anybody has some questions, but I'll see you guys next time.
Dan, a personal question. So where in Germany were you?
I was the first time I went there, I was in